The Center for Policy Research and Evaluation at the NYU Metro Center presents a parent-led conversation series focused on family engagement. Hello, my name is Danielle Perry, and I am a Senior Research Associate and Manager of Research to Practice Partnerships at the NYU Metro Center. Hi, Wendy. Thank you for joining me today. We're here to discuss your piece, What My Father Taught Me and Why Families of Color Belong in Higher Education. Do you want to start by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about what inspired you to write this piece?
Yes, thanks. So my name is Wendy Perez. I am a senior research associate at NYU, and a lot of my research is centered on families, looking at families, especially families of color. I use critical frameworks and asset-based frameworks to for my research, and I'm also looking at how families connect to higher education. So those are really important research interests for me. And why I was inspired to write this, as I was thinking about connecting families to higher education, I really thought about my own personal experience and the ways that I felt that my family was not connected to higher ed. And one of my biggest inspirations, my heroes, was my dad. He really was my first teacher, especially when it came to academic text and history, literature, and to me it was such a a disservice. I think that he wasn't as much of a part of my college journey as he could have been if there was just a stronger connection with my college and just families in general, but particularly Spanish speaking families, immigrant families. I think there's a particular disconnect with those types of families and my experience. And I think that disconnect continues to this day. So, yeah, I think that was a little bit of the inspiration of why I wrote this piece.
Thank you for sharing those experiences. I want to start by asking some questions that better understand your personal reflection and identity.
Mhm.
You began talking about this a little bit already, but can you discuss what role your father played in shaping your academic identity and your confidence in your academic abilities?
Yes, so definitely. My dad was a voracious reader. He loved to read quite a few books, and some of the things that we talked about were part of those readings. And so I learned a lot about literature and history through our conversations, and not so history meaning just all over the world, like world history. So we talked about the Civil War, the French Revolution, Greek civilization, but we also spent a lot of time talking about Latin American history. So I knew about leaders, thinkers that shared that identity, the Latine identity that I have. So leaders like Eloy Alfaro in Ecuador, who pushed for public education, or Simon Bolivar, who tried to unify Latin America. We talked about poets. And so I really saw myself as someone who could be that intellectual, that creator, that leader, because it was those main characters. They were main characters in civilization, in history, in literature. And I really thrived in learning about that, and also just the conversations that I had with my dad. They were very, debate was welcomed. It was actually fun. It was just a fun experience that we would have where we would talk about this text and history and also current events as well, because a lot of what, history and literature, it connects to what's happening now. And so it became really normal to just have conversations based on what we've read, what we've talked about, and ask critical questions about why things happened the way they did. And so for me, um, everything was for me. A lot of times I feel like things, especially like college or elite conversations, or even being considered an intellectual, it feels like it's for certain people, or you know for certain, whether it be racial and ethnic demographics or people, genders, or if you people with money. But for me, everything was for me. And I think that's the gift that he gave me, is to see myself as an academic and intellectual, someone who could engage in discourse, critical discourse, at a very young age. So I just grew into that. It was just very natural to kind of continue to build on that as I got older. And I don't think it's an accident that I'm an academic today. And I just still continue to love engaging in discourse and reading and learning. And so I think that that was why he was such an important influence in my sort of academic and intellectual journey.
That sounds like such a beautiful experience that your father crafted for you, the ability to engage and have a natural discourse in topics that really resonate with you.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering how that experience translated into the classroom. And can you talk a little bit about what you described as the disconnect between your home life and your school culture?
Yes. So the way that translated into my schooling is that I was a very curious student, and I did love school. I loved reading and writing, and did well on all of those subjects. And I had that confidence. Kind of, to me, academics, it was almost like a sport. Like, what more can I learn? What other challenge can I engage in? And in all subjects, right? And I think that's sort of how I built on that identity that my dad shaped in me, which is a very just confident identity, and very open to learning, and also willing to challenge what doesn't connect. And so I think the disconnect at school, for me, and I did go to predominantly white institutions for most of my K through 12 and also for higher ed. Um, it felt like it was strange, like something was unusual and strange, that because I was a Latina who was academically inclined. And so for me, that was it was like cognitive dissonance, where for me, that was very normalized. There's a history of Latina intellectuals, and then I go to school, and it just felt like I was one of the few. So I was one of the whenever I did a gifted and talented education program in honors, advanced placement, even though there were a higher population of Latina students in my school. Um, they were predominantly white, but we were still a critical mass at the schools that I went to. They were very underrepresented in those spaces. So I was one of the few. And when you're one of the few, you start to think, do I belong here, or why am I one of the few? What's going on? And also, there's some teachers that were very explicit about how strange that was, right? And so in K through 12, these stick out in my mind because they're just experiences that you would never think happen. But one of my middle school teachers, because I was one of the top students in his class, instead of saying, "Wow, Wendy, you're one of the top students in my class," he also congratulated me for not being pregnant at my age, which is not even something that I had considered. And so, and another teacher I mentioned in the op ed is a teacher when, because I did the honors all the way. But when I went to the class, she had felt the need to explain to me that our class was extremely hard. And I didn't see her doing that to other students. So it's just these small messages, whether it be just the lack of students who looked like me and teachers who explicitly were telling me, "Hey, you're different. You're not supposed to be this way." And even though it's sort of a backhanded compliment in some ways sometimes, and so then that's when it was very strange, because in my family it was normal. It's like, of course you're going to do well in school. Of course you're going to be curious, ask questions, be a leader, be academic. And in school, it was like you're the exception to that rule. And that was very weird and strange for me. And I think when I got to college, the experience was similar in that I went to a predominantly white institution that had very little students who were Latine, who were faculty. There's not as many faculty of color, and there wasn't a lot of connections to families. And so it really felt that this is sort of like an elite space, an elite academic space that really just didn't have as much room for connecting to, families that were of color families, first gen families, immigrant families, um, and also that people who looked like me, weren't really represented in the faculty ranks. So I think there was that feel, which was unusual because again, I was like, of course, I expect a lot of faculty to be academics, and that is sort of how I felt from home. But then you go encounter an institution, and you don't see folks like that who are actually in places of power, which is teaching us or administrators, higher education administrators. So that was another disconnect too. Once I got to higher ed, that I experienced, right?
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's very disheartening to hear about the many instances of micro and macro aggressions that you described, and the ways that it often makes students of color feel out of place, even when the educator's intention, quote unquote, may be to congratulate them on what you described as being the exception to the rule. Whereas in our homes and our communities, we understand that this is normal, right? To be smart, to be exceptional, is normal, but for others to see it as some type of achievement. So thank you for sharing those experiences. And I want to ask you to dive a little bit deeper in talking about the concept of funds of knowledge, and why do you think that it's an important concept to understand within the scope of the academic experiences that you described?
Yeah. So for funds of knowledge, I think it's a really important concept and framework, and I've used it quite often in my research because I think it acknowledges just the richness that occurs, that develops in families, in family understanding, their knowledge, and their experiences, and how important that positive contribution is to their children. I think we often experience a deficit notion of parents, especially those of color, that are just widespread in schools, in other community institutions. And it's always parents are framed as a problem. Like, what are they doing wrong? What can they do better? And they're not really seen as allies and assets. And what funds of knowledge does is that it flips that. So it flips this idea that parents are problems and deficits for their children, and really looks to see within the families what are those assets that families are giving their children that are helping them navigate the world, especially education, right? And so what I love about funds of knowledge is that it does trace that, and it looks at how families are encouraging their children and the ways that we can connect this to their success in school. And I think some of these assets are where parents are motivating their children to work hard as their parents are working hard in their jobs, and encourage their children to do well in school. They're very much supporting the cultural identity, which is important even when we talked about belonging. Students are affirmed in who they are, in their racial and ethnic identities, in their languages, their home language as well, that they may be bilingual. Um, and so they're also shown this collective power. So in families of color, and I've been talking about like Latin immigrant communities, college is not always an individual experience. It's something that you do for yourself, but you also do it for your community. And I think that comes from that networking, that familial aspect of that comes from families, certain families of color, where it's collective, right? It's communal. Our experiences are something that we do not only for the family but beyond, and networks are beyond your nuclear family as well. And so, I think these are some of the strengths that can be used in higher ed and to navigate other educational spaces that come from families that aren't always acknowledged, or leveraged by higher education spaces and other educational institutions as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of culture and belonging, I want to shift gears to speaking a little bit more about that.
Mhm.
And I want to know if you can describe From your experience and expertise, how do you think higher education institutions can create spaces where students of color can fully bring their cultural identities?
Yeah, I think there's several ways that they can acknowledge families of color, students of color, and where they're from. And I think specifically with their cultural identity, I think one of the ways is what I've led with, which is engaging their families in higher education. And I've seen, I went to a conference last year with higher ed professionals who work with families, and there was really wonderful models of how to do this. And I think one of the ways that families can be engaged is to do ongoing outreach to them, whether that be through apps or letters or emails, something that that community responds to, so that families know what's going on in higher education. Again, these are, their children are doing a higher, and it's not saying that they don't have their, of course, individual agency and experiences, but at times families, knowing that families, especially first gen families or families of color who have not gone through these institutions, these higher ed institutions, they don't know all of the resources that a college has that could, and if they knew it, they could help their students navigate through it. Because there's even a college that did academic briefings for parents so they knew what was happening in the classes. And that's something that if you have more experience with that, you can support your children. Because I've heard several stories of, and that was my experience too when I struggled in academia, and I was one of the top students, right, in my high school. I'm in this elite college. I kind of thought about, should I be here or should I go home? And home wasn't too far away. And I think it's that idea of when you face struggles, I think the natural inclination for families is to say, come home. We can support you. It's not worth this stress. Or if they don't know how to help in a different way, they're encouraging you to come home. But if they have a knowledge of more resources, if they're welcome to your campus, so that's another part of it. It's sort of how do you create a welcoming climate for families to support students. But I just think that knowing the resources to support your children, not only into college, but through college, I think is really important. So that's one piece of it. The communication piece, the climate piece, welcoming families, and it means going beyond orientation. So, what other uh, events can you do? Again, like these academic briefings, it could be more discussion about resources to support their children, or just space on campus that where families can come more often to feel like they're a part of it. And I know this can be challenging for families who their children may be far away, and so maybe that could be a virtual experience. I think we've seen in our work, Danielle, like a lot of families are now very good about Zoom and the virtual communities, and but it's just being very intentional about saying that families are important. So I think that's one way that we can increase this belonging for students of color. I think other things that I mentioned are more faculty of color, because I do think when you can see yourself in someone that is in a place of power within an institution, so faculty of color, the administration, you start to feel that people like you can do that. And that's kind of the same thing talking about in the curriculum, where people of color are main characters, they're not side characters. They're acting, not being acted upon. So I think both in the faculty ranks, the administration ranks, in the curriculum, it's important that students see themselves in all of these positions with power and agency, and that I think makes them feel like they belong because it gives them sort of that idea, that trajectory, whether it be through the curriculum or through people they see in actual positions at the institution, that they can see themselves being there someday, and putting that sort of dream that they have, showing how it looks in actuality. Again, in the present and also in the past, and even and in their future, of course. So I think that those are some important things that can be done. And lastly, just having more spaces that affirm students of color. Um, whether, and I know there are centers, but sometimes that's just not enough, right? Like it could be um, funding for students to create their own spaces or hiring staff that encourage that. Just finding ways where students can build community with others who share their identities. And again, I am focused on students of color in our conversation, but it could be first gen students. It could be students who are from certain other communities that there's just so many identities that folks share um, that make them feel like they belong. And so I think that creating affirming spaces, funding those spaces, having staff that can build that community, and also empowering students to do that is important for higher ed spaces and for these types of students that we're talking about today.
I think you shared a lot of really rich examples, highlighting systematic issues that happen when representation isn't fully conceptualized. And one of the things that I really want to say resonated with me that you shared was that people of color are main characters and not side characters. I think that that's something that's really important to understand and really be able to see on the surface level.
Mhm.
Um, One of the things that I would like to kind of dig a little bit deeper in, that you talked a little bit about already, is what happens when families of color are marginalized and left out of higher education spaces? What are the specific consequences of that action?
Mhm. I think when families are left out of higher ed, I think it creates just a disconnect for students where they might feel, like they have to choose, I don't know, their college campus over their families, because there's just not that ability to kind of be in both worlds. Um, because again, if their families maybe don't know what's going on in education, with their classes or how to navigate some systems, it can be it can be isolating, right? It can be isolating for the families and the students because the families really want to support their students. And like we talked about, there's so many funds of knowledge coming from families and the ways that they've already supported their students. And I think it's adding that extra layer of um, in higher ed, families are still welcomed to understand what is happening with their children because even though the children have independence as college students, it helps if families know what resources are out there. So if their student is struggling, they can, um, you know, say, "Oh, did you try the counseling office?" Or there's actually some tutoring here. Um, and also, I think that when higher education centers cultural identities, has events in different languages, I think it also shows marginalized families that they are they do belong in higher ed. Not only their children, but that they also belong, because for college for a lot of people seems not even just like the most elite institutions, but it feels like it's beyond their reach, that it's not for them, especially if they didn't go to college. I know some families think if I didn't go to college, there's nothing I can do for my kids. I don't know what I can do. They've just got to, they just have to make it on their own. But the closer connections there are between higher ed and families, especially marginalized families, it disrupts that myth, that notion that families are not able to support their children. And again, whether it be through like academic briefings, centering culture and identities that students of color, marginalized students share, this and communicating that to students, but also to families, it begins to build this culture of that college is a hub, it's a community hub versus strictly this academic ivory tower that's away from the community, from families. And so I think that that is what's so significant about higher education institutions and colleges that are really trying to bridge that gap and say that everyone's welcome here. All types of families, all types of students, having a diverse student body is important to these colleges. Just creating that kind of connection is something that will just create, yeah, a different idea of where families belong in higher ed. Because I think people say we really, higher ed staff, administrators, and even through K through 12, I'm sure teachers and other folks who work in college access spaces want families to be engaged. They don't know how to do it, maybe that's the thing, is that it seems like a great idea, but you do have to be very intentional about putting practices, policies in place to make this a reality, to make families feel welcome and informed and valued um, within higher ed institutions.
I think you've done an amazing job painting a picture to help listeners understand what you mean by when you describe two worlds that students of color are often navigating. This world that exists where they are embracing and fully understanding their cultural identities, their histories, their languages, their people, their stories, and then navigating these academic spaces where those lived experiences often aren't translated.
Mhm.
I think you've also done an amazing job of helping listeners understand the importance of bridging these two worlds together in ways that help support students and their families navigate educational spaces.
Mhm.
Mhm. When we're talking about family engagement at the K to 12 level, we often see what you described, right? Where we see families become empowered and emboldened to use their voice to share their stories and be more active in decision making that's happening in the schools and in their communities. What can colleges learn from these practices if they are enacted in the higher education space?
I think there's a lot that higher ed can learn from K through 12 family engagement. And I think one of the most important roles of parents and family engagement is that they are also decision makers, and which means that they're included in decision making bodies within schools. And for higher ed, what that could look like is having parents on a committee in a decision making space where they can have opinions and insight on things that affect their children, things like the curriculum, like what we talked about, curriculum that centers diverse populations, diverse cultures, thinking about something that impacts them a lot, like financial aid, and what does that mean for students, and how are parents engaging with that. And so I think just finding ways to actually have parents who have some power within higher ed is something that could be replicated from K through 12. And I know it's a more difficult in higher education to do because there's even more of a disconnect in families. But I do feel that parents who have children within higher ed are really compelled to want things to be better for not only their children but other young people who are going through higher education. So I think that's something that could be modeled. I know that also in K through 12, parents have, to make real change, have also visited policy makers, legislative offices. And so, thinking of having parents in decision making bodies, on committees where they can give their opinions, where people in power will actually listen and make changes and really consider the families that are often not represented in the institution, when they really consider their opinions about how things are done. Um, Beyond those committees, that could also be leveraged to policy change. And again, policy change about what can be taught in higher education, policy change about how students are funded, because so that students aren't priced out of it, of being able to go to college without having to take on an unsurmountable amount of loans, and even the ideas of hiring more faculty of color and administrators of color. And I think parents can also give a lot of insight into why that's important for their children. And so I think those are some ways that um, that could be helpful that emulate K through 12, but and also that communications piece. In K through 12, those institutions, those schools that do a really good job of communicating with parents, they work really hard to find different ways to engage parents. It's events, it's classes, it's again an app, it's the WhatsApp if that's what parents are using. And so there's some time and intentionality into looking at what the communities around them, what the students that go there, what their families can respond to. So there's actually a real effort there. I think we've seen the efforts where well, we had something at 11 a.m. and parents didn't show up, so parents don't care about this. No, that's not true. Parents were working, they couldn't make it. Did you offer something else on a weekend? Or, and again, this isn't true for all spaces, but it's being very thoughtful and intentional about true engagement. I think that could also be replicated. So don't just have an event and again, call it a family event and say, okay, nobody came, nobody cares. That's not real engagement in my eyes. Because if you don't consider um, the actual families that you're trying to reach, the space, the language. There's so much that goes into this, and to sort of engaging families. Then I think, yeah, that kind of effort won't be successful. A very just low, I guess, low lift effort. I think it will take a lot to engage families in sustained ways, um, and that's something that could be funded and institutionalized to even make it more of something that becomes just a part of the institution, a part of the culture, right?
Yeah, those were really great examples. And I think it speaks to kind of your level of expertise and understanding in this area to really be able to point out what you described as really efficient ways to really engage families beyond just the college orientation days. One of the questions that I have that I feel like a lot of folks may have as well is we often think of college being the time where children are transitioning from, what we see as our babies into becoming adults and making their own decisions and living their own lives. What do you say to kind of those folks who may question why it's still important for families at this stage to be as involved in helping shape the educational experiences of their children?
And what I agree that college is a time where students, are growing, they are becoming adults and in some ways, yeah, moving away from some of maybe it could be their homes and families in the ways that they have sort of that independence and agency to choose their classes and choose their friends and activities and I think that's an important process for students. And so when I think about families supporting that, I think it's in addition to students exploring that. And I think some pushback that I've had in the past or things to think about is I'm not trying to replicate helicopter parenting or whatever that word is. I don't see families supporting students of color, marginalized students as something where they will be, navigating every step their student takes. But I do think it means that their support is still meaningful. Um, it's meaningful in spaces where students haven't always felt like they belong. They belong in their families. So for so many students, because of what we've talked about, because of the strong cultural identity, the funds of knowledge that have been um, uh, that they've experienced with their families, and so to me, families are an additional resource and an additional support to, as their students sort of navigate their growth in college. And again, it could be something where they, again, learn about resources on campus and they share them with their students because their students may have not known about them. They have so much going on, they may not have paid attention. It could be where there's some classes centered on culture and parents can respond to that because it could be their culture or can share their experiences, and that supports their children as well. And so also research shows that it does help, right? We have qualitative stories. There's some colleges that actually track family engagement and contact and see how it impacts their students. And so research shows that family support helps students and to persist and to be successful in college. And so that is what I imagine in family engagement. I imagine things that are supporting students to not only get into college but persist and graduate. um, but of course, students still have agency. They still have their autonomy to experience, yeah, what they want out of their college experience. So I don't think of it as um, it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both. Um, and that's a thought I have. And as I mentioned earlier, for a lot of students that we were talking about, student of color, marginalized students, it's a collective experience anyway, whether it's acknowledged by the institutions or not. It's a collective experience. And so this is acknowledging that that's a strength and building on it. That's how I imagine it.
Thank you so much for describing that so eloquently. I think one of the things that we often say in our work is that families are the experts on their children, their needs and their experiences, their assets and their beliefs. And I think that it's really great that we continue with that understanding once children are getting to the higher education level in the ways that you described, and that oftentimes historically and presently marginalized communities often rely on each other for that shared knowledge.
Hmm.
And bringing those families into the fold to acquire those knowledge and resources, not to handhold their children through the experience, but to support them and make sure that they have the information and tools that they need in order to be successful as they're navigating a new space. And I think that also informs and enriches the community to better support more children as they then enter into that new space as well. So thank you for describing that in a way that the listeners can really understand and see and feel. As we wind down our conversation, I really want to spend a little bit of time thinking of a call to action, right? So, as folks are listening to you share some experiences about your piece and your beliefs on family engagement and higher education, what are some things that folks can take away from this conversation and begin to actively do? So how can we think about higher education institutions more actively engaging families of color in decision making and policy?
Hmm. I mean, I think that it what it will take is for higher education institutions to start making this a priority, where they assign funding to it, staff to engaging families, and I think it could look like what we talked about. So creating spaces where families can be invited to campus on a regular basis. That takes someone who is working on reaching out to the families, right? So I think it's family outreach. It's not expecting families to kind of just know to come on campus, but it's doing ongoing, regular outreach, letting them know what's going on campus, what events they can come to, and even going beyond to the academic briefing parts that I spoke of. So I think it looks like having just a list of priorities that will engage the communities. Um, that students of color represent. And so I think those are some of the ways they can do it, but it is a plan. It's a plan to implement, right? Higher ed institutions have to do. It can't be an aside. It has to be very intentional for them. So in this plan, if they can have funding and staff to begin to do outreach, to create spaces beyond orientation where families can learn about resources, where they can talk about too, classes that are focused on culture, race, different experiences that families can connect to. and even invite families to some of those classes, right? Because that usually only happens once a year in the orientation, but to have other times where they invite families into actual classes with faculty members, that would be something as well. I think that would help families feel engaged. But I think the most important thing is to create a plan and to think about your community. And so that could be where you do, needs assessments, or not a need, that's actually not the right, not needs assessments, but where you can talk with families, call them on the phone, um, do some focus groups just to see what families need, what they are wanting for their children, and actually talk to students as well. And that's some of the research I'm trying to move forward is let's talk to students and of color, marginalized students to see how do they want their families to support them? Do they have any ideas? And I think that's an important piece to start this process too, is to talk to the families, talk to the students, and see what they would want, and then create a plan, and then um, implement some of these ideas that we've talked about. I think that will make it a reality, but it has to be something that has resources and a plan to actually happen. It doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? It's something that it takes infrastructure and commitment to do.
And my closing question is, why is this work urgent right now?
I think this work is urgent right now because I feel that our educational spaces need to reassert their commitment to honoring the identities and experiences of students of color. I think in our climate right now, there's just too many um, ideas and public opinion, public discourse that are starting to assert again just the negative and deficit notions of families. So negative and deficit notions of families of color, immigrant families, yeah, just families who are not wealthy. It's just that is in the discourse right now, and this idea that we shouldn't center culture, that we shouldn't center identities, that's somehow going to encourage racism, encourage discrimination, and that's a bold lie. It's a lie. It's not true, because whether it's acknowledged or not, these identities, these experiences, um, they shape us. So, your racial identity, your cultural identity, your lived experience, your families, they shape you, and often, of course, in positive ways. And I think that that's what we need to lift up. That's what we've seen in our research, Danielle, and that's what we see in just families every day that we run into and talk to. Families care about their children. Families of color care. They're trying to support their children. And it's important that institutions respond to that truth. That is a truth that families care. And what can institutions do to build on that, to build on the resources that families have? I think that's a truth that hasn't been circulated as much. I think again, the mistruth, the myth that families of color are only bringing their children down or not supporting and building our communities. I think that myth needs to be eradicated. And I think this is one way to do it, is to continue to have institutions respond to and acknowledge and highlight. And that's what I want to do in my research, is continue to focus on the strength of families of color and marginalized families, because there's so much strength and resources there that during this time are not being leveraged and honored. So that's why I think this work is especially critical right now.
Thank you, Wendy. I've greatly enjoyed speaking with you today, hearing your story, and learning from your experiences. Is there anything else you would like to share before we conclude the conversation?
No, just thank you for having me, Danielle. It's been really wonderful to just honor my dad today, Jorge Kleber Perez. Te quiero. Um, and just honor other students who, yeah, will have experiences like I have, other students of color, maybe first gen students, and I hope that institutions, higher ed institutions, and families, and other researchers can just listen and hopefully gain something from our conversation that they can put into practice.
Thank you, Wendy. To find more resources on family engagement and parent leadership, please be sure to check out the Center for Policy Research and Evaluation's website, including our research brief series on engaging student and family voice.